All right, I think let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Erin Heath. I'm Director of Federal Relations at AAAS. That's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we house the Golden Goose Award, which we'll tell you all about. But first, I'm going to turn it to my two co-chairs to introduce themselves, starting with Meredith.
Meredith Asbury, Assistant Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy at the Association of American Universities, which was one of the founding members of the Golden Goose Award and continues to support it along with AAAS. And Gwendolyn?
Hi, Gwendolyn Bogard. I'm the Senior Government Relations Officer at AAAS, so I work directly with Erin.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk about our agenda. Next slide.
All right, so to give you a brief outline of what we plan to cover today, we'll explain what the Golden Goose Award is and what we seek to award, review in some more detail the nomination process, and some other ways the Golden Goose Award is distinct, perhaps from other awards, and then leave some time at the end for any questions. So with that, Erin, I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
All right, and first I'll tell you about the award. If you're tuning in, you're probably a little bit familiar with it. The Golden Goose Award honors federally funded research that has essentially had an unexpected impact on society. And I'll tell you how it started. Many years ago now, Congressman Jim Cooper approached a few organizations, including AAAS and AAU, with an idea. He had been watching another member of Congress, Senator Bill Proxmire, give out what he calls Golden Fleece Awards. Those were to target what he considered to be wasteful spending. And sometimes those recognitions, if you will, targeted scientific research. And Jim Cooper wanted to turn this kind of negative narrative on its head and showcase the positive stories about science and the way it can go in unexpected and exciting directions. So after a number of conversations, 9 founding organizations got together and started this award to tell these stories in 2012. So next slide, I'd like to give a flavor of just what the Golden Goose Award is like. So we're going to show you a 5-minute video of one of our past awardees. And I'll say, if you want to read more Golden Goose stories or watch more Golden Goose videos, visit our website. It's an absolute treasure trove of good stuff. But for now, we'll start with this one.
To begin with, each bee is going to get a little dot of the orange paint, just a little dot on the tip of the abdomen. Because their body temperature is below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, they're immobilized. Now I'll take each of these bees and put them in the recovery chamber. It's labeled another little bunch of bees.
I had been interested in how could you possibly control a whole bunch of robots without any humans around? I had gotten a Presidential Young Investigator Award from National Science Foundation. So I had wanted to work with John Van der Vaart, and he heard Tom Seeley talking about honeybees on NPR.
Tom was simply telling his story, and it immediately struck me as one that was relevant for industrial engineering.
So we started to read up on honeybees. An enormous amount was known about what one bee does, but nobody had figured out what that means for the colony. What happens on the system level?
John sort of joked, maybe the honeybees should hire us as consultants. That's an interesting question. How do the honeybees do it? We laugh because we probably could not help them, but maybe they could help us.
How good is the colony at gathering nectar to survive the winter?
The key part of this investigation was creating a situation in which I could monitor what the individual bees were doing. If you want to count how many bees are working that food source, you have to be able to identify every bee. So you know that that bee's been there, and that bee's been there, and that bee's been there. And to do that, I had to create a study colony in which all 4,000 worker bees or labeled for individual identification.
We had predictions as to how the honeybee colony would allocate its forager bees amongst different patches.
And when we did the experiment, the bees nailed it. And I think we were all rather stunned by how well the bees had solved that problem.
So then, years later, Sunil Nakrani knocked on my door, and he wanted a good algorithm to allocate the servers at a web hosting facility. Over the next 15, 20 minutes, my jaw started to drop because everything he said matched up with what the honeybee colony faces.
At that point, he pulled out a paper, actually. He had a paper that he had written with Tom Seeley and then John Bartholdi way back, 15 years odd. And then just put it on the table, and we started going through. And as I described more and more details about the problem, he found a corresponding kind of structure match in the problem that honeybee is trying to solve. And that's the point we were really excited.
And the real clincher was when a honeybee follows a waggle dance, she usually doesn't make it to the new flower patch on the first try, and takes a little while for her to get more efficient. So it's not a zero cost to change from one flower patch to another, just like it's not a zero cost choice to repurpose your server and take care of the weather channel instead of the bank. Companies that are web hosting, at least one very big one, is using this algorithm, and it generates anywhere from 5 to almost 25% more revenue.
If the work wasn't funded in the first place, the result that they formulated 15 years ago, even if I had come up with this problem, we couldn't have been able to go down this path.
The federal funding's indispensable, essential ingredient.
When you do research, you don't know where it's going to lead. The discovery, the understanding for me is the most fun thing.
My greatest satisfaction comes from the pride of just being able to unravel this piece of nature.
All right. That was bringing back some really good memories for me of interacting with that research team. So that was nice to watch. Okay, so as you heard, the Golden Goose Award was started by a member of Congress. It was his idea, and we worked with him to get it going. And since its inception, the Golden Goose Award has enjoyed bipartisan, bicameral support. So members of Congress come to our ceremony every year, and they talk about the benefits of federal support for scientific research and development. And they've not only talked about it at our ceremony, but they've also talked about it on the House floor, congressional hearings, in the media, and with their constituents. So we informally call them our gaggle, and we're really happy to have them in our corner. Meredith, over to you.
All right. So the nominations for the award can be submitted anytime through our website. And the link is there at the top of the screen. Our typical award cycle usually commences on the heels of our last award cycle, which is capped off by our award ceremony, which we just held last month in September. And so from October to December, that is really when we are focused now on collecting nominations for the next award cycle and the next ceremony in September 2025. And we do accept, as I mentioned, nominations throughout the year, but to be considered for the 2025 award, we have set a deadline of Friday, December 13th for those nominations to be submitted. And that's because in January, our selection committee will meet to review all of the submitted nominations from the last year and evaluate those, looking at the 3 criteria listed here: the quality of the science, impact of the science, and the quality of the story. We should also emphasize that in addition to those 3 criteria, in order for any nomination to the Golden Goose Award to advance, it must have a clear federal funding connection. That is the lens in which we look at all of our nominations. Of course, sometimes there's also a mix of funding sources related to a project, but ultimately, the federal funding component is why we tell those stories. So it's an important qualifier for the award. We do ultimately select 3 awards each year. Nominations can be for individuals or for a team of researchers. And the nominees don't all have to be from the same institution. As you saw in the 2016 award video, multiple nomination can come from research collaborations across institutions, industry, federal labs, or international partnerships, so long as there's a federally funded component. We also don't set a limit on how many individuals can be nominated as part of a story. That being said, we often think there's a natural limit to how many people you can award and still tell a good story, because ultimately that's our goal, is to tell a compelling, easy to understand story. And so if there's usually more than, I'd say, 5 in a nomination, we may need to take that in and do some refocusing to really narrow down the story to ultimately what we're trying to award and trying to communicate. We do not accept self-nominations. However, organizations or individuals are not limited in the number of nominations they can submit. We have seen individuals group together to submit a nomination. In addition, nominations have come from universities, research administrators, professional societies, and industry groups, to name a few. So moving on to the criteria on your screen, here is a partial copy of the nomination form questions. There are 4 questions total, and I will go through what we're looking for in each of those. But overall, these questions align with the criteria I mentioned earlier, to which our selection committee evaluates these nominations. I would also point out on our website, we have put together a document on helpful tips for submitting a nomination. And I'm going to walk through now some of those helpful tips just related to each of these questions. So the first question on our nomination form is: describe the specific nature of the research conducted by the nominated individual or individuals, including the specific federal agencies that supported their work. When completing this section, we're really looking for an introduction to those involved in the research, establishing a time frame inclusive of their initial work, the discovery, how long it took, context for the timing if that's relevant. You could also highlight if here, their scientific process. Where did something go wrong, or was something unexpected? If something did go wrong, was it disappointing, or what was the reaction to it? We also see nominations include here information on if there's any unique qualities about the researchers themselves, or the struggle some may have had to get federal funding, are just a couple of examples of things that could be highlighted. We're also looking for a clear statement on funding and how the research was supported. And if you can go back to the last slide, I'll cover the second question on the nomination form, which is: the Golden Goose Award recognizes silly sounding, serendipitous, and surprising research that has contributed to society. Here, explaining when you're completing this section, we're looking for you to kind of help us tease out what makes this a good candidate for the Golden Goose Award, highlighting what may make the research or other aspects of the story seem unusual, obscure, or sound funny in some way. Was an idea initially ridiculed or went against a general understanding in a research field, or something others believed, may never work. And so another way to think about this section may be: is there a sense of that the project didn't necessarily have a clear societal impact at the outset? And those are all useful things to share. And then on the next slide, the third box of the form asks you to explain how the results of the particular research were unexpected, unforeseen, and or serendipitous in nature. This question may seem similar to the second question we just covered, but we're really looking for here a little bit more detail on the results of the research, as opposed to the last question, which was more focused on some of the initial reactions or the early work. So in this section, there may be an element of serendipity or surprise by a result. Other questions to consider here are, did the researchers expect their work to lead to a certain understanding or discovery? And is that ultimately what happened? And perhaps the research, followed along a pretty straightforward path, but the impact or eventual use of the research was unexpected. And so those are all good things to point out here. And finally, the fourth question on the form asks you to describe the economic, societal, and/or transformations, scientific impact of the research. So answering this question of how did this research make a difference? How is the impact measured? Are good things to identify. And the final section on the form is to provide us with additional resources. This can be links to research publications, funding award information, news articles, video links, or any other materials that can really help us validate the research work and the nomination story. And sometimes this is provides the most critical information for us, again, in helping to validate the story that's been presented. And so that's a very quick summary of the criteria and the award questions here. But I will turn it back to Erin.
All right, thanks, Meredith. And just to give you a sense of the range and the impact of the Golden Goose Awards, here are some examples of previous Golden Goose awardees. We have on the top left, Charles Towns, who invented laser technology, who was one of our very first awardees in 2012. Below that, a team that developed a widely used drug safety test using, of all things, horseshoe crab blood. We've recognized John Eng, whose work resulted in the development of an early GLP-1 medication for diabetic patients. Catalin Carrico and Drew Wiseman for their work on mRNA, which is relevant to the vaccines we all know and love. And a team who discovered a non-opioid pain reliever hidden in the venom of tiny cone snails. So this is just a snippet of the wide range of stories that we've been able to tell through this award. Overall, we've recognized more than 80 researchers since the award's beginnings. Actually, 15 Golden Goose awardees are also Nobel Prize winners, including Jeffrey Hinton, who just received a Golden Goose Award last month, and then this week now a Nobel. So it's been a really great run for him. Congratulations, Jeff. So while we do have a lot of well-known scientists in the mix, we've also had the privilege of telling stories that haven't really been told before or told in a different way. And that's extremely rewarding for us. Next slide. Back to you, Meredith.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, what makes the Golden Goose Award different, perhaps from some other awards, is the emphasis on federal research funding to help support discoveries. And so here we have a chart of those federal research connections to previous awardees' work. Probably of no surprise, we see NIH and NSF often as the most common supporters of awardees' work. This is where a lot of the basic research work is funded from, including DoD. So that's not too surprising. The tracks with our award stories. That being said, we'd love to add even more federal funding connections to this list. And so there's no limitation on what entity within the federal government support can come from. And we welcome nominations that allow us to tell a variety of stories and their connections to federal research funding. Next slide.
All right, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about this year's awards that just happened last month. And we each took lead on a story. So I'll tell you about woodpeckers first. This is Jeff Walters. He is an expert in bird behavior, and he set out to study the breeding and habitation patterns of red-cockaded woodpeckers and ended up unexpectedly finding a way to help recover this endangered species. And that work was funded by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, the USDA Forest Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
And I can talk a little bit about the middle one. I was following the the awardees that we lovingly called the penguin poop awardees. So they found this really interesting way. They developed an algorithm that scanned satellite imagery to pick up bright pink penguin poop in Antarctica. And so with research funding from NSF and NASA primarily, they developed this whole penguin population tracking system. What's interesting about this story is that it initially started back in the 80s. The initial researcher, Matt Schwaller, started trying to figure out this algorithm, but the computing power just like wasn't there. There was like a technological gap in what they needed. And so he abandoned it for a little bit and then was able to come back and then connect with some other researchers, Heather Lynch and Chris Che Castaldo, who then built out this whole huge algorithm and discovered some 1.5 million penguins, Adelie penguins in Antarctica that hadn't been documented before. And it's a really wonderful story of like conservation. But in addition, there's a lot of cost saving that goes into like saving money on like building efficiencies of field research trips, saving federal funds, even being able to monitor like public health issues, bird flu has been tracked down into Antarctica. So a really interesting example of kind of what seems like a pure conservation story, but then has like impacts that go out farther.
And our last story, which we mentioned, Aaron mentioned earlier, Jeffrey Hinton, was related to the AI story that we were able to tell this year, which really started with cognitive science, psychologists research on the human brain. They were trying to, the prevailing theory at the time was kind of not working in the research field, and they wanted to find a new, perhaps theoretical framework to be able to explain some of how human cognition was working using it and looking at the neural structure of the brain. And so, long story short, this goes on to underpins much of the artificial intelligence neural network platforms that are being created today. And Jeffrey Hinton was awarded the Nobel for part of his applied work in that area.
All right, and this is our last slide before we get to the Q&A. So this would be a good time if you do have questions to go ahead and post them. This is about our annual ceremony, which is, it's a great event. It's held every September on Capitol Hill. We would love for you all to attend either live or virtually. It's also live streamed. Successful nominators not only get to come to the ceremony, but also get an invite to our exclusive awardee luncheon. So do keep an eye on our website and social media next year for more details on the 2025 ceremony. And now we're going to move to our Q&A. We do get some frequently asked questions, so we'll go over a couple of those. I'll kick it over to you, Gwendolyn. What have you got for us?
Certainly. I'll start with you, Meredith. Could you talk a little bit more about the nominations deadline this year? What timeline we're looking at?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the nomination deadline is Friday, December 13th. After December 13th, we will continue to collect nominations. The form doesn't close, but they may not be in our pool of nominations to review for the 2025 award cycle. And one important thing that I didn't raise earlier is, once a story is nominated and say it's approved by our selection committee, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be awarded in that year. So again, we only award 3 stories a year, which can sometimes mean we have more approved stories than we can award in that year. So we will hold on to any approved nominations and try and work that into a subsequent year. So one example is, this year, the artificial intelligence story was actually submitted in 2016. And then there was a new nomination that came in this year for that award that made us relook at it. And so we thought, oh, this is the right time for this story to advance. Sometimes it's the simple fact that we can't in identifying and reaching out to the nominees. Sometimes we can't always get a hold of them right away. And so that can put a delay on when we can put that in our award, our awards that we issue each year. We're also looking to just balance certain factors, like we don't want every award to have a heavy NIH or NSF connection. Now, I say that the awards this year did have all connections. Every story had a connection to NSF, but it wasn't the only agency connection. So we try and keep a balance of that to be representative, and also just representative of the researchers and the pool in which we have, and try and make that as diverse as possible.
Awesome, thank you. Next, we have a next question. So a little bit about the selection process. After someone submits a nomination, what happens? What is the next steps that we go through?
Yeah, sure, I could take that one. There's a multi-stage selection process. So the first step is that all of the nominations in a given cycle go before our selection committee, and that's comprised primarily of scientists and science communicators from different disciplines. And then a subset of those that have particular promise then go to our steering committee for another round of evaluation. And then a subset of those then go into the research phase, which is where the team really digs into the stories and learns even more about the nominees. So it really does go through several steps.
Lovely, thank you. Let's see, we have another question. I guess this is kind of getting at after that. If what happens if someone's nomination is selected? What happens next?
Yeah, so if the nomination that you submit is advanced by the selection committee, you will likely be hearing from one of us here, myself, Gwendolyn, or Erin, to schedule a follow-up conversation with you to kind of talk about the nomination. I mean, it's hard to capture everything in writing in a submission form, and so we will want to know. Additionally, if you have any way of connecting us with an awardee, as I mentioned, is sometimes actually the hardest part in awarding is reaching the nominees, and sometimes that can take a while. So we'll often work with the nominator to make a point of contact, but to also be clear, it's not a requirement to nominate a story and know the individuals in which you're nominating. But we often find the nominator can be a good place for us to start with trying to find that information. If ultimately your nomination will be awarded, we will let you know and invite you to the award ceremony. Depending on if the nominator has a connection to the story in some way, you could also be asked to be part of the documentary video or help us vet the written story that we put together.
Great, thank you, Meredith. We have a question getting at what are elements that you look for in a good nomination, and I'll add, what are some common mistakes you see in nominations? So mistakes versus elements of a good nomination.
Yeah. So Meredith touched on this a bit in the nomination process part, but a good nomination has the following three things. Number one, has to have some federally funded research. This is usually the easiest of the three. You can usually demonstrate that with federal grants. Second thing we look for is demonstrated impact. This is really important. It has to have made a difference, and it has to be a difference that we can see and that we can talk about. And number three, it has to have some element of the unexpected. This could be serendipity, or it could be that the research was odd or obscure and ended up going in a completely new direction. There are all sorts of ways to tell that story. And then in terms of the nomination itself, again, we are in the business of storytelling, so having that really clear narrative really helps us evaluate, and the selection committee evaluate the nomination. And also we love having sources. So the more sources that can provide additional information, the better. So those are some elements of a good nomination. Common mistakes that we see, I think the number one common pitfall is the impact is not clear or is too early to really evaluate. So we're not looking for maybe this will happen, maybe this will come out of the research. I mean, that's interesting for sure, but it's not the kind of story that we're telling with this award. That's why we say demonstrated impact. And then the last thing I want to say about what makes a good nomination, just that we're looking for diverse nominations of all sorts, including from a range of career stages, disciplines, geographies, etc. So those are some of the things to keep in mind when you're putting together nominations.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Erin. Let's see, and finally, I'm seeing right now, I have for the nomination form, if someone has a seed of an idea, but it seems like either it's nomination form doesn't have time to fill it out, or just whatever logistically do we have any other routes to communicate ideas for nominations? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so my suggestion is to reach out to one of us here. We can be a good, we're happy to work with you on a nomination or be a sounding board for a nomination idea. And what you, and kind of draw out what may be good to include in a nomination. I should note, we're, Gwendolyn, Erin, and myself are not on the selection committee. So we are kind of a neutral party in sense of we know what they're looking for, but we can also provide feedback and advice on what good submissions look like. So I think also, if you're trying to figure out who exactly should be the nominees or what, we can also just help kind of focus what the Golden Goose Award would specifically focus on in a research story. So I think reaching out to us is probably the best first step.
Lovely, thank you. That's all the questions we have for now. So I'll turn it back to you.
All right, well, I just want to thank everyone for being here. We're really excited to kick off this new cycle for 2025. As Meredith said, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We look forward to working with you on some exciting new nominations.